There is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, "Be without food, but don't be without shelter or home." There is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, "Be without food, but don't be without shelter or home." Shelter is very important than food. I was working as much as you can work, like 3 jobs. Even with all of those efforts, I couldn't afford to even get a little bit time with the kids.
At the age of 16, I entered the American foster care system. I've pulled myself out of some pretty bad spots, but I needed housing, and what I was making was just not cutting it at the time.
How can a family grow and prosper if they don't have a home that they can afford in a decent neighborhood?
In the past several years, the situation has become more urgent than we've seen even 10 years ago. It has implications for people's lives.
There are so many American families that don't have enough income to afford rental housing. Half of the renters in this country are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
The low-income housing tax credit allows investors to invest money in housing and get credits, and the result is funds to build additional low-income housing.
The Section 8 vouchers are the primary way to help people afford housing.
Vouchers are a way for a resident to get into an apartment that costs more than what they can afford with their 30% of budget allocated to housing.
There definitely would have been a lot more detours, a lot more failures, a lot more uncertainty.
Now I know that I can enjoy the life, being with the kids, and have a brighter future.
First off, I think housing is a nonpartisan issue, but I certainly believe that the bipartisan approach to solving it is what needs to happen.
Every social goal that we want for the people of the United States revolve around housing. A precondition for making progress is to have a decent place to say, tonight I'm going home to rest.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dennis Shea, and I am the Executive Director of BPC's Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. At the Terwilliger Center, we are guided by a core belief that every American family deserves a decent, safe, and affordable place to call home. The center works to advance bipartisan legislation that addresses our country's most pressing housing challenges. And of course, among these challenges is the rising incidence of homelessness. Today's webinar will give us the opportunity to learn from innovative local solutions to homelessness and to better understand how federal resources can empower communities to design and implement their own locally tailored strategies. A panel of experts will share their organization's successes and offer insights into solutions that can be scaled to meet the needs of communities across the country. But before we get to the panel, we are delighted to welcome a very distinguished guest, Congressman Suzanne Bonamici, who represents Oregon's 1st Congressional District and has made preventing and reducing homelessness a top legislative priority. Representative Bonamici is a leader on the House Education and Workforce Committee and is the ranking member of the Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education Subcommittee. She is also the co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness, where she leads a team of legislators who are committed to tackling the national homelessness crisis through evidence-based strategies and policies. We're also proud to have Representative Bonamici as a member of the Terwilliger Center's Honorary Congressional Council, where her insights and expertise are invaluable to our work. So I want to thank you, Congresswoman Bonamici, for joining us today. It's great to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Thank you, Dennis, and thank you to the Terwilliger Center, but also the Bipartisan Policy Center and everyone who's here today for this important conversation. It's great to be with you.
Well, great to have you. Let's just start at the top. I mean, you're a leading advocate in Congress to address homelessness, particularly as co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on homelessness. What initially motivated you to make tackling this seemingly intractable issue a major focus of your legislative work?
Well, thank you. Some of it comes from my background. I started my legal career at Legal Aid here in Oregon, and you quickly learn that people aren't struggling by choice, and oftentimes they need some support to get them through tough times. And I represent a district here in Northwest Oregon that has urban, suburban, rural, lots of different areas in it. And as I travel around and talk with people, even pre-pandemic, but certainly to this day, I hear that housing is a challenge in every corner of the district. And every community has unique needs, but they're all wrestling with a lack of affordable housing. So I understand that this is not a new issue. I started talking about it years ago. But we need to have these conversations with people and inform the work and meet the needs of the community. And we know my goal in Congress and the way I view legislation, look at policies, is this going to make the future better for the people I represent? And it's hard to be optimistic about a better future when people don't have a place to call home. So I really made it a commitment because in the other issues I work on, whether they be access to affordable childcare or affordable higher education, getting people into the workforce, it all starts with that fundamental need of a home.
You recognize that housing is foundational to everyone's life.
Absolutely.
It's not just shelter, it leads to better health outcomes, better academic achievement, upward mobility. So, I mean, you've introduced HR 8297. That's very Washington technical language,
Yes.
but it's called the Project Turnkey Act.
Right.
To create a federal version of Oregon's Project Turnkey, which would help communities repurpose vacant buildings into affordable housing and shelters. Why do you think this model is well suited for expansion on a national scale, and what are the key steps to ensuring its success across the country?
Well, the Project Turnkey program is something that the Oregon legislature did, and oftentimes we look in our local communities, and if we see something that's working, and it's a good idea, we often say if it works in Oregon, it can work across the country. And the Oregon legislature passes legislation that really is making a difference here in Oregon. And I've spoken with people who have benefited from the program. It's basically providing federal funding to help convert vacant buildings, whether they be hotels, motels, offices, hospitals, other properties, into affordable housing and emergency shelters. So my Project Turnkey Act is modeled on that successful bill that passed here in Oregon that has been implemented. I'm grateful that Megan Loeb is here today to talk more about it, but it really has made a difference. It's a smart and economically feasible way to increase access to housing and emergency services. So it launched here in 2020 and has already served thousands of adults and children, and it's still growing. And I visited some of the sites, and you talk to people and see what a difference it makes. There was a couple who was recovering from a serious accident, and they'd almost lost everything, and the Project Turnkey site gave them hope. There was a single mother of a toddler, and she had escaped a domestic violence shelter to a shelter, but then found a place where she could recover and feel her child was safe as well at a Project Turnkey site. So I took this model and created it into the Project Turnkey Act that would be through HUD and provide funding annually for communities to meet these needs. And I also made it one of the most flexible sources of federal housing assistance, because that's another concern that we've heard about in the community, is that oftentimes there are just too many guidelines. It's too hard to get around the barriers. And so we wanted this funding and made this funding flexible. It also expands homeownership opportunities and provides additional support to people who are at risk of experiencing homelessness through rental security deposit and utility bill assistance, because we know it's much better for members of our community, and it's much more effective to keep people in their homes rather than help them once they've been evicted or have to leave a home. So it has that flexibility. So I'm excited about that because it's an important feature to have when we're addressing the needs, because everyone has their own story and everyone has their own situation. So more we can address that flexibility and get that funding out there and use existing space, it does make a difference.
So by using existing space, is it more economically efficient than rebuilding or building new space? You're getting more bang for the buck by doing so?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, that is has been shown through the Oregon project as well. So it oftentimes the sites were developed for less than half and sometimes less than a third of the typical cost of building new affordable housing. And I think statewide, the average cost of a unit of affordable housing was about $226,000, but the average cost of a project turnkey property was about $87,000. So it really does make a difference, but it also takes advantage of the empty spaces and creates homes and places for people in buildings that already exist. So it really has been a great model here.
Well, thank you for that, Congressman. We look forward to hearing from Megan in the next segment of the program. Many experts argue that homelessness is closely tied to broader issues of housing supply and affordability. So how do you see those issues or challenges connected both in Oregon and nationwide? And how can policymakers address immediate relief needs while working toward long-term housing solutions to prevent homelessness in the first place?
I think we understand that the federal government has to play a role. It's going to take all of us working together, state, local, federal, public, private. And we know you mentioned earlier the low-income housing tax credit, for example. There's potential with that. We need to work on that. We just absolutely need to get more housing. And you know, the cost of housing has increased so much more than wages. And yes, wages are going up in some places, but in Oregon, a worker who makes minimum wage would need to work 2 jobs to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So it's true across the country that housing is just too expensive. I recently heard from a small business owner who said she had to move back in with her parents because her rent went up 25% in 1 year. So it's just way too expensive for people. So I'm committed to doing what I can at the federal level. I know we need to expand the housing stock. I mentioned the low-income housing tax credit, but other programs that we need to get people through hard times, whether it be increasing access to SNAP, affordable childcare, things that keep costs down, those all make a difference too, because too many people are choosing, you know, do I put food on the table or do I keep a roof over the heads of my family? So it's really tough. So if we can get the more units built, do more with vouchers, do more with project turnkey sites, all of this together. I wanted to mention a couple of other bills too that I've introduced.
Sure.
That would make a difference and are related. I have a Building Housing with Care Act that would, when affordable housing is being built, include co-location of childcare. And I visited a site here in Oregon where they're doing that, and that makes a tremendous difference to the families and the kids. If a parent doesn't need to get on transit or find a way to get to the childcare and then get to work, and just know that when they come straight home, their child is there in an affordable childcare co-located site, that would help as families as well. And then I also have a bill called the CHEERS Act, which is an acronym, and that's bipartisan legislation. This is something I hear about in communities as well. If someone needs help, if they need support, if they need treatment, oftentimes it's hard to get transportation to some type of support services or you know, a detox site or behavioral health services. So the CHEERS Act is really designed to close that gap and help people get the help they need to get them back on their feet.
Well, thank you for sharing that information. We're working on a paper or a short paper on the co-location of affordable housing and childcare. So we'll take a look at your your bill, but thank you for
Yeah, building
mentioning it.
housing with care, and yeah,
Okay.
from the families I've heard from who experience this, it really does make a difference.
Thank you for mentioning that. So, I mean, securing, we're all about bipartisanship at the
Right.
Bipartisan Policy Center. No surprise there, but I mean, securing bipartisan support for homelessness solutions can be challenging. What strategies are you using to build consensus across the aisle for more comprehensive long-term response to homelessness and housing instability?
Yeah, well, you're right about the importance of bipartisanship, and I strive for that. You build relationships for one thing, but then
Right.
the more conversations and the more we can have, and the more stories we can tell about how when everyone does better. The way I look at it is that we all do better when we all do better, right? And if we have members of our community who are without a home, that affects our whole community. And so I always look for consensus across the aisle. I might not agree with every issue, but you find that common ground. And housing is a basic human need. It's really hard to argue with that. So I see, again, telling those stories. I do have a bipartisan piece of legislation called the START Housing Act to increase access to recovery housing. That is a bipartisan bill. It's a program that started as a pilot in certain number of states. So my Recovery Housing Act, or START Housing Act, would just expand that program across the country. We started it several years ago, and we know it's working. So that is bipartisan. I mentioned the CHEERS Act, that's bipartisan. So there are places where we can get together. Actually, my CHEERS Act has me and 3 Republicans. So there you go. So you build the relationships, and then you tell the stories, and you work with people, and you have to understand that this affects everyone in our community. It affects our economy, and when people can get into housing, they're going to be more quickly involved in the workforce and contributing back. And so these efforts should be bipartisan, and I will continue to strive for that.
Well, here. You also mentioned the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which would significantly expand and strengthen the low-income housing tax
Right.
credit program. And that has enormous bipartisan support. So we're hopeful you can convince your colleagues in Congress to move that legislation early next year.
I hope so.
elections.
Well, we
Yeah.
also have a lame duck too, so we're not giving up.
Okay, there you go. Well, Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you as well for all your great efforts in Congress. We really appreciate it. And thank you for working with us at the Terwilliger Center and at the Bipartisan Policy Center on these important housing challenges that we need to really solve to make
Indeed,
our
we
country
do.
a better place. So,
Thank you. And thank you for all of the work you do. And I look forward to our continued work together.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now it's my pleasure to turn the discussion over to my colleague, Associate Director for Housing, Francis Torres, who will lead a panel discussion with some experts who are doing some great work at the local level. Francis?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dennis and Congresswoman Bonamici, for that insightful conversation. Hi to everyone watching us today, and thank you again for joining us at the Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy here at BPC. As Dennis mentioned, my name is Francis Torres, and I'm Associate Director for Housing and Infrastructure here at the Center. And I'm really excited to host today's panel conversation, which will focus both on some local successes in addressing homelessness, as well as identifying some of the challenges that local organizations face in tackling this complex issue. According to the most recent federal count, roughly 650,000 people across the country find themselves without shelter on any given night. Meanwhile, respondents to a recent poll that BPC fielded with Morning Consult have noticed an increase in levels of homelessness in local communities across the country, especially in urban areas and cities. All this to say, the issue of homelessness is increasingly gathering national attention, with policymakers often lamenting that there seems to be no end to this crisis and seeking out potential bipartisan solutions. However, local organizations are rising to the challenge, implementing new approaches, and collaborating with city, state, county, and federal government to meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness. Here at the Terwilliger Center, we're interested in learning from these examples, learning from local organizations and innovative new approaches, and knowing what lessons they hold for policymakers and stakeholders at all levels of government as they work to promote housing stability and address the crisis of homelessness in the United States. We're also very interested, and the conversation with the Congresswoman is testament to this, in understanding how federal government can best be a partner to local organizations and other levels of government to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. So to that end, today we will hear from representatives of different kinds of organizations, a community foundation in Oregon, a faith-based service provider in San Antonio, and an innovative database organization from Cincinnati, Ohio. So we're lucky to have with us some great speakers today, including Nikisha Baker, President and CEO of the San Antonio Metropolitan Ministry, Inc., an interfaith ministry serving those experiencing or facing homelessness in San Antonio. We also have with us Kevin Finn, President and CEO of Strategies to End Homelessness, that leads the coordinated effort of 30 partner agencies to prevent homelessness and assist unhoused people in the greater Cincinnati region. And we also have with us Megan Loeb, Senior Program Officer at the Oregon Community Foundation, the lead organization in implementing Oregon's Project Turnkey, which we just heard about in the earlier conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Before I get into the questions for our panelists, if you're watching this live, please do submit questions for our panel at any time. We'll get to them near the end of the conversation, and you can post them in the chat if you're watching this on YouTube. So I'll just kick it off with a general question for all of our panelists. Last year's point-in-time count revealed the largest increase in homelessness since HUD started this national count. As the scale of the problem identifies, or at least identifies by these metrics, what new challenges have emerged in your work, and how have you adapted your strategies to address this increase in homelessness? And we can kick it off perhaps with Nikisha.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much. So San Antonio has continued to see an incredible increase in population growth, which also adds, of course, to our count experiencing homelessness. We've seen in our community large consensus and collaboration around addressing the issue of homelessness. In fact, our local city conducted a poll of residents of the city where they said the number one issue that faced them was the issue of homelessness that they wanted to see addressed. This allows an opportunity for leveraging not just the federal resources that may be available, but also state and local resources in a collaborative way. One of the things that I think is maybe not so innovative, but does seem innovative today is homeless service providers on our local level gather every other week to work through our strategic housing implementation plan. We provide updates, we garner feedback, we identify gaps, and address issues in the moment on an ongoing basis that helps provide better service delivery to our clients and community. And so that's one of the ways that I think we're innovating to keep our numbers low, as low as possible. It's also important to point out, we see our point in time count as relatively flat compared to population growth, which we think is an important distinction given the explosive growth that we've seen in terms of residents of San Antonio.
Thank you, Nikisha. I'll move on to Kevin.
I think we have been very fortunate in Cincinnati that in years even before the pandemic that we really changed our focus to homelessness prevention. So actually during the 3, full years of the pandemic, we saw declines in homelessness in Cincinnati because we shifted what resources we could toward prevention, including Hamilton County putting a good chunk of their COVID funding toward prevention. So as a result, we've actually seen a decline in homelessness 3 years in a row. Then in 2023, homelessness went back up, but by 1.5%. So not at nearly the levels that some other communities have seen. But I think that is because we had prevention programming that was already up and running, which we could then put COVID funds into. And I should mention, I would never dream of planning for how our system works locally using only point-in-time data, because it's terrible data. So the numbers that I gave are an unduplicated count of people served in our system in any shelter or street outreach program during the year. And those are data points that are much better used for planning purposes in a local system.
Thanks, Kevin. And you brought up 2 points there that we'll get to later in the conversation around the data quality and also about the importance of prevention. So I also want to give an opportunity to Megan to answer our kickoff question.
Thank you so much, Francis. I'm delighted to be here with you today. The Oregon state issue is a little bit different than many other states. We historically lack shelter infrastructure, and the West Coast in general lacks shelter infrastructure. We have the second highest rate of unsheltered homelessness in the nation, which means that 2/3, 66% of our homeless population is unsheltered. In Oregon, that means that 13,000 people at a minimum, as Kevin noted, the point in time count is notoriously an undercount, but that means 13,000 people are sleeping unsheltered every night in Oregon in the elements. And that presents a really unique challenge for us. I think like Kevin and like Nikisha, we have seen strategies in Oregon around prevention that have been very successful in better data, better coordination among providers, really making sure that those experts that are leaning into best practices are able to share with each other and lift up promising strategies. Those are things that in Oregon, I think are helping us to reach solutions, but we have a unique problem. We have a population in Portland, for example, where I'm sitting today that is similar to the population of the city of Boston. But in Boston, I think there's less than 5 or 10% of their population is unsheltered. And here in Portland, over 2/3 are, which means that as people are moving, often block by block as they're getting swept, we continue to see the challenge of providing services, coordination, and help and trust to people when they're not easily able to be found and to receive those services.
Thank you, Megan. And segueing perfectly into our next question, just on the topic of the lack of shelter in your state, I would love to stay with you for a minute and just talk a little bit about Project Turnkey, which we just heard from Congresswoman Bonamici about her proposal to bring sort of a federal vision to that program, or rather have a federal version of the program inspired on what's transpired in your state. Some observers say that a key advantage of Oregon's Project Turnkey is that it was managed by a nonprofit, the Community Foundation in this case. This was perhaps something that allowed it to move faster or more nimbly than a public agency. I would love to hear just about your experience and the Oregon Community Foundation's role in running this program and enabling fast decisions in an environment that was truly an emergency, right, at the onset of the COVID pandemic. And more broadly, just a bit more of an explanation of this public-private model and some of the lessons it holds, as well as just any information you want to share about the program itself with our audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis. Well, Project Turnkey was a program that was born in the midst of a crisis here in Oregon. We had a severe lack of shelter and housing. And when the pandemic hit, and then when we were hit with devastating fires, where we lost over 4,000 residential structures in a matter of days, we knew that we needed to act quickly to prevent deaths and to provide increased shelter capacity. We came together as a big tent to brainstorm. That group included legislators, it included the private sector, it included philanthropy, and we emerged with a plan. And the plan was to call on our legislature to allocate grant funding that would allow community organizations around the state to buy motels and hotels and convert them into emergency shelters. We could keep residents safe through the pandemic, and we could safely rehouse people temporarily who lost homes due to fire, and then eventually that stock could convert to permanent housing inventory. I think had this not been a crisis, we may never have been asked the question, but we were asked if we would administer these funds because so many of our other important state agencies were in the midst of other pandemic and fire recovery efforts that took their bandwidth and their capacity. And so we were happy to administer this program on behalf of the state. Oregon Community Foundation is a trusted grant maker. We have relationships across the state, and we have expertise in grant making in a rapid way. So we convened a diverse advisory group that included folks with lived experience. It included experts in affordable housing. It included members of our legislature. It also included people who have experience with disabilities to help us really look at and vet properties to make sure we were creating durable assets that were going to make sense for the long term for the state of Oregon. And ultimately, the $125 million that was invested in state funds was used to create 32 new shelter properties around our state that are operating as transitional housing, emergency shelter, and in some cases even converting to permanent housing that has increased our state's capacity for shelter by 30% in a really short time frame. And part of that was because we were able to be nimble and flexible in the administration of the project. One of the key things that we were able to do is provide technical assistance to applicants. What that meant was that rural communities, smaller nonprofit organizations, and culturally specific organizations were able to receive assistance through a very complex acquisition process through real estate consultants. That allowed for shelters to be stood up for the very first time in communities and in populations that previously had not been served in our state. I think the other thing that was helpful about having a community foundation serve in this role is that after the state grants were out the door, after the motels were purchased, we realized it's not an easy thing to take an old 1960s motor in and operate shelter. And so we invested as a philanthropic organization in our state in technical assistance, in one-on-one consulting, in a learning community to elevate some best practices with the amazing service providers around the state who own and operate these properties and who are able to provide services every day to our most vulnerable neighbors. So having a community foundation serve in this role was important, but we didn't do it alone. We had a diverse group of partners. We had our state housing agency work side by side with us to make sure that we were elevating and honoring the priority populations in our state plan, especially so that these organizations that were receiving this asset could also receive ongoing operation funds moving forward because they were aligned to our state plans. We worked closely with partners, with people with lived experience. I'd like to call it the ultimate group project, and we were honored to be the administrator.
Thank you, Megan, for that summary of the program, and certainly very insightful for our audience to learn about that example. On the topic of collaboration, that leads me perfectly into my next question for Nikisha. Nikisha, SAM Ministries, as an interfaith ministry, right? Its work is grounded in collaboration and community. This is clear from your work, from your materials. And I wanted to ask, it is one of the multiple faith-based organizations across the country that are at the front lines of addressing the issue of homelessness. And I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the unique strengths that faith-based organizations like yourself, SAM Ministries, bring to the broader network of service providers, housing initiatives, and other partners tackling homelessness, and more generally, your experiences in collaborating with organizations in San Antonio to address the problem of homelessness there.
I think that collaboration is, of course, the foundation for the work that we do. We were founded by 11 area congregations who gathered together to start what was a soup kitchen now more than 40 years ago in the basement of a church. And we've grown to meet the evolving needs of our community. What does that mean for us as an interfaith ministry? I think it allows us to see all of the individuals that we serve, to be able to treat them with dignity and compassion that they may not otherwise be subject to. One of the one of the things that is most meaningful that I believe that we do in community is we facilitate the Homeless Memorial each year on the winter solstice. While not an event that is unique to San Antonio, what is valuable about how we deliver that programming in community is we invite our friends who are experiencing sheltered and unsheltered homelessness to join us in the park to celebrate the lives of friends and family members, neighbors who might have passed away. It means the world to them to see our mayor and our county judge and elected officials, along with all of our homeless service partners, on the same platform, acknowledging by name each of the individuals who we've lost. Compassion, dignity, and respect are key and pivotal in the way that we deliver services. Sometimes that's forgotten in more clinical or sterile environments. And I think that is our particular niche or angle as it relates to being an interfaith ministry. Collaboration is just in our blood, right? We need volunteers to make ministries run. And so we're able to take some of the professional expertise that we've acquired over the last 40 years and pass that along to churches when we have inclement weather, when there's snowstorm, when there's flood, when there's storm. We're able to prop up with our congregation partners emergency shelters that are just temporary to help meet that immediate need, whether that's for a few days or for a few weeks. Feels like we've been in the summer of 1,000 summers this summer, but and so it's been a little bit longer. But working together in community, not just to address the housing needs, but also to provide the wraparound supportive services that are what are going to keep our clients stable for the long term is an important part of that collaborative effort.
Thank you, Nikisha. I want to pivot over to Kevin and just talk a little bit about your organization's proactive, data-driven approach to preventing homelessness. You mentioned earlier that prevention was a key part of your strategy in Cincinnati and a big part of the success you've had. From what I understand, you work by tracking indicators like utility shutoffs, eviction risks, to have a sense of who might be at risk of falling into homelessness and who is in a position where taking a prevention-centered approach can be most beneficial. Could you walk us through a little bit about just your model, how it works, and highlight some of the successes you've seen in keeping families housed before they reach a crisis?
Sure. Now, I would mention first, our bread and butter, the foundation of what we do as an organization is very similar to what both Megan and Nikisha just described. So we are the COC lead agency. We distribute federal, state, county, and city funding, as well as private donor funds for homeless services. So we perform that central funding function that Megan was describing. But then I always kid that in Cincinnati, to allocate those dollars, we don't go to the bathroom without a community process. So like the process that we have for actually deciding how those dollars should be used bears a lot of similarities to what Nikisha was describing in terms of being highly collaborative and having all the agencies at the table. But the foundation of what we do is working with people who are already homeless. We have made the decision in recent years, though, to make our focus going forward on prevention. So we have a well-established shelter diversion program that we've been running for 12 years now, which is now doing a research study with the Lab for Economic Opportunity at Notre Dame University to document the effectiveness of that program. And then new this year, we started a second project where we are using predictive data analytics to identify households at the highest risk of receiving an eviction notice, so pre-eviction notice. And along with our partner agencies, we are proactively reaching out to those households to try to head off their housing crisis, with the goal being that they never actually get the eviction notice. The Congresswoman used the term before, people are choosing between expenses. Well, as people make choices between expenses, that creates a data trail. If people are managing to scrape together the money for their rent, but the way they're doing it is by starting to visit food pantries or underpaying on their utility bill or different things like that, that creates data that can be used to identify who those households are. And what we are doing is using predictive data analytics connected with those types of data sources to identify families early. That project just went live in July, so it's a little early to sort of report out anything in terms of outcomes, but that is the latest prevention effort that we have undertaken.
Thank you, Kevin. And staying on that subject, because I know it's of interest to a lot of people listening, I would love to hear a little bit more on how strategies to end homelessness relies on these partnerships and this collaboration with government agencies, with other entities, nonprofits, to access data for these prevention efforts. And also perhaps if there are some key lessons from that work of accessing data, of making sure that you can get that key information, how can federal resources better support data-driven prevention programs? What can be done to stand up more of these across the country?
Well, I would say first, just by way of example, we are getting data from local government entities about households that have previously experienced eviction. We're using our HMIS data, data from our centralized shelter intake system, but we're also getting data from other local nonprofits, St. Vincent de Paul, the Free Store Food Bank, who those are some of the doors that people show up at if they're having trouble making ends meet. So accessing their data is very insightful to us. We are also using things like multiple listing service data on multifamily properties that have recently been listed for sale, because eviction rates in those types of buildings immediately after they're sold are significantly higher. We're trying to access utility disconnect notice data, all sorts of things like that are indicators that a family's their situation is a little bit on the rocks, but maybe they haven't actually gotten the eviction notice yet. We're getting data from our public housing authority, who is both the biggest landlord and therefore the biggest evictor in the county. We're getting data from them about people who are behind on their rent, also people who newly applied for subsidized housing as an indicator, again, that maybe something's going wrong in their current housing. So it's just a matter of sort of identifying what data is out there and going after it. There are about 15 other data sets that we are still pursuing and that we are gradually incorporating into the predictive data model.
Thanks, Kevin. And we're certainly interested in the data, the information, the analysis that you can report out once you've had more time in this program.
If I could, one other part to your question was how the federal government could support it. How about funding prevention? Like most of the federal government dollars, the federal government is as if they make it as difficult as possible to do anything preventative with the dollars that they provide. So I think it's a real simple answer to the question of how the feds could help with this type of prevention. Let us use some of the money for it.
I'm tempted to want to stay on that topic and maybe open it up to the three of you on how can federal government best support prevention efforts? What are the silos that would need to get broken, or what are some of the initiatives in that space that you all think might be helpful?
I'll go if nobody else has one. So, the continuum of care funding, which is the largest source of funding from HUD for homeless services, is largely restricted to serving people who are already on the street in a shelter or fleeing domestic violence. Well, our shelter diversion program serves people who are doubled up, who are not yet on the street or in a shelter. And our predictive data analytics project is serving people pre-eviction notice. So, we have all this money coming from HUD where we have to wait for people to be homeless before we're allowed to help them. How about let us use some of it for prevention? So that flexibility built into the COC program is one way it could work. ESG, or Emergency Solutions Grants funds, can pay for prevention activities, but that's a pittance. There's hardly anything in that bucket of funding compared to the COC funding. So if Congress would actually put some money into the bucket that can be used for prevention, that would also be helpful. Or they could just combine those programs. But I think the key is giving local communities the flexibility to use dollars as opposed to dictating to local communities how the dollars should be used.
I'd also tag on to that the Emergency Solutions Grant funding, ensuring that it is able to serve households with income levels that are ultimately sustainable, right? At or below 30% of area median income is extremely low income. If those limits were pushed up to 50%, we'd find that the households that we serve are actually able to maintain housing stability longer than 18 to 24 months post intervention, because we're not just treating those who are extremely low income and unable to maintain for longer terms. I'd also add that homeless prevention provides a compassion and dignity that homelessness can never afford. The human toll of the experience of homelessness can be avoided in many instances if you divert a household from falling into that cycle, and it can provide multi-generational impact that is yet to be seen in communities.
Yeah, I would just echo what Nikisha has just said about prevention really not only being a best practice in terms of the overall cost. We've heard from local providers that when they're able to prevent homelessness, it's typically at a cost of about $3,000 per household. Whereas when they are needing to put somebody into temporary housing or shelter, the cost to them is $15,000 to $20,000 per household. And so we know it's a best practice in terms of cost, but also in terms of trauma, in terms of the dignity of solution. And I think that's one piece that we don't give enough of an emphasis to. We understand that in today's point in time count, for example, that 5% of our point in time count is youth across the nation. But 50% of chronically unhoused adults report that they were homeless as a youth. And so how do we think upstream? How do we invest in prevention so that we can also have that protective coating over families and not prevent generational homelessness, which is what we are starting to see?
If I might add a couple numbers to mirror what Megan mentioned. In Cincinnati, it costs us $4,700 to serve each person who becomes literally homeless, and 25% of them will become homeless again at a cost of $4,700. By contrast, in our shelter diversion program, it costs $1,600 per person to help somebody get back into their own housing, and we are 95% successful. So at a third of the cost, the outcomes are way better. We're not allowed to use the HUD funding for that.
Okay, thank you all. It's very insightful and important conversation. I'm glad we're having it. I'll just take a brief moment to remind our audience members, if you want to ask a question, we'll get to some at the end. Please type them out in the chat. We'll get there in about 10 minutes or so. And I'll just pivot to the broader topic of affordable housing. And I think this dovetails very neatly with what you all were saying regarding sort of upstream measures to before you get to the point of someone being homeless, being able to ensure that there is sufficient housing and sufficient supports ahead of that. There is a lot of research and a growing consensus that the lack of affordable housing is a key driver of homelessness across the country. How do you all perceive that relationship between housing shortages in your communities and homelessness rates? And what role do you see local initiatives such as yourselves and the organizations you represent playing in increasing the supply of affordable homes in your communities? And we can kick it off with Megan.
Thank you, Francis. Back in 2019, Oregon Community Foundation, we led some research, we funded some research to understand the key drivers of the increase in homelessness that we were seeing in our state. And what we learned is that in the previous decade in our state, for every 10 households that were formed, we built 6 units of housing. And so what that did is it created tremendous pressure on our rents. We had more people who were severely rent burdened, spending more and more of their dollars to pay their rent every month. And we had more people falling into that housing instability position. And so we knew that our growing problem with homelessness was really fundamentally a problem with access to abundant, affordable housing in our state. We knew also that shelter is a policy of last resort. We didn't want to overbuild shelter infrastructure, but we needed to do something. And so as a community foundation, we have wanted to invest across the continuum, to make sure that there are funds for those immediate outreach and social services that are critical to saving lives every day, but also to invest in the standing up of affordable housing, which we've done through a loan fund by providing early pre-development dollars at very low interest to our community development financial institutions and our community development corporations in our state to create more affordable housing. And then also looking at solutions around workforce housing, making sure that median income housing is built so that we have that healthy continuum. And then finally, homeownership. So those have been places where we have operated as a foundation to make sure that our state continues to have a healthy continuum of housing. Project Turnkey in particular was a 1-2 punch when it comes to looking at the root cause of homelessness in our state and providing solutions, in that it immediately offered that promise of shelter to communities, but longer term, it provides a durable asset that communities can steward over time to meet their shelter needs. Many of the Project Turnkey sites right now are in the midst of transition to permanent housing as the needs of their communities have changed, as fire recovery efforts have been successful and other permanent housing has been built and the need for short-term shelter has lessened. They have begun to transition those units to permanent housing, addressing our root cause in our state, our root cause of homelessness in our state, which is a lack of affordable housing. So we're grateful that initiatives like Project Turnkey have that exponential power to create longer-term assets that we can steward over time.
Level here in San Antonio, we've seen in 2022 the passage of $100 million housing bond specific to affordable housing. So our community is investing in affordable housing across the continuum, to Megan's point, right? We can't just fund low-income affordable housing. We have to fund housing targeted at 80% of AMI. We have to fund housing targeted at 100% of AMI, because any squeeze that we've seen in community on any piece of the continuum causes reverberating impacts across the spectrum. We're also in a community where nearly 50% of local households are cost burdened. So they are spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And so that spans the spectrum from the teachers who are working in our local school districts, to first generation college students who have graduated and are now entering into the workforce. How do we ensure that there is appropriate stock? Leveraging the federal resources that have become available with those of our housing bond, we've been able to create this encampment to permanent supportive housing kind of pipeline that provides a pathway and steps along the way for individuals in our community, getting those off the street, out of encampments, into shelter in the short term as permanent housing units are being turned, right? Whether that's conversion or new builds, so that we can have continue to grow that continuum and pipeline.
I would just mention that in Cincinnati, we're very lucky right now that the city of Cincinnati and Hamilton County are very focused on affordable housing development. That is definitely the main cause of homelessness. And there are a lot of good organizations along with the city and the county working on affordable housing development. Because that we have all of them active in that space, we as an organization have really been focused more on the prevention side. But only because there are a lot of other organizations leading the charge on affordable housing.
Thank you. And that I think speaks to a lot of concerns and questions that many people in our community and our audience who are housers, but perhaps not as knowledgeable about homeless services, or vice versa, certainly have. So appreciate your insights on that. All three of you have pointed to the process of braiding resources, federal funding with state and local funding, with philanthropy, with nonprofit resources. And I would love to hear, right before we get to some audience questions, briefly, any ideas around how to best braid these different resources, how to best leverage and deploy existing federal funding, And also, as perhaps some of these funds taper off, some of the funding that was made available as a result of the COVID pandemic starts tapering off, what are some of the emerging challenges or questions that are left open for federal government to address? Anyone wants to kick it off?
I would say that, there's a chicken or the egg aspect to homelessness prevention. Since the federal government largely doesn't fund it, most communities don't do it. And therefore, there's not a lot of identified best practices and data on what works in the homelessness prevention space, not because it doesn't work, but just because a lot of communities don't do it because the feds won't fund it. So, I feel like we scratch and claw to pull together dollars to do prevention. It would be great if the federal government would look at the data from the prevention programs that do exist around the country and identify some best practices and fund them.
So SAM Ministries is currently working on 200-unit permanent supportive housing development in community that combines low-income housing tax credit, city housing bond fund, some ARPA funding, and philanthropy. Given our base and our background, that's been an interesting exercise in pulling them all together to get that development launched and across the ground, and certainly one that's taken quite a long time for us. It's been about 2.5 years in the making. So understanding the resources that may be on the horizon coming into community, whether that's state or federal funding, and trying to mirror or partner that. I think we've been strategic in San Antonio and Bexar County in that ARPA funding has largely focused on capital, infrastructure, capacity building needs, so that there is less of an ARPA cliff, right? So when CARES funding and ARPA funding all wraps up, there will be less of a cliff because we've focused on providing some of that infrastructure, some of that capacity building, and focusing on capital and those kinds of investments that now federal government can come along and support for the long term operationally. So it's having the strategic conversations, looking at the landscape as to what is becoming available, and then working together in community to find the best solutions.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly that owning an asset, having a durable asset that can be leveraged, I think is really key in terms of being able to braid funding and being able to continue to meet the needs of the community. And I'll just give an example that our project turnkey operators talk endlessly about what it means to actually own and steward an asset that can give them roots in their community, can afford them the opportunity to partner with community partners that are able to offer services for them, and to not be at the whim of operating dollars that may come and go. When they were leasing hotel rooms, for example, they weren't able to make commitments to community partners because it was at the whim of that motel operator as to whether or not they might have rooms. Whereas, now many of the sites work in partnership with the local healthcare systems to say, we can provide you 5 rooms for respite care on a contract. And not only is that a sustainable revenue source for them, but it's also a stronger partnership that offers a mutually beneficial relationship between our healthcare and our housing partners. So I think in terms of braided funding, there's a lot that we can learn from collaboration, but it comes down to owning that asset that they can steward over time to meet the shifting needs in their community and to have the agency and flexibility to use in their own way. And I do believe that fundamentally is one of the biggest successes of Project Turnkey.
Thank you for that, all of you. I'll use the last few minutes just to get to a couple of audience questions that are quite topical. One of them is just going back to the question of data. Should we move from talking so much about PIT data, point in time data, and move towards the inflow and outflow data? What do you see in your city or state when you look at homelessness from this inflow outflow data perspective? Kevin,
Kevin, chicken
yeah.
or egg?
You go first.
I will say on the San Antonio front, we have shifted to utilizing our homeless management information system as a better metric for measuring homelessness in our community, or the experience of homelessness in our community. Those who are actively engaging with the system, whether that is through diversion or homeless prevention, or because they actually fall into homelessness, we're using those counts. And so while our local number is 3155 in the most recent point in time count, our homeless management information system says we see closer to 9,800 individuals over the course of the year who need some sort of intervention or diversion. And so I like the idea of comprehensive and holistic measurement that's available through HMIS rather than the point in time count as a single measure of an issue on a single night.
You know, what I would say about point in time count data, it's the lowest common denominator. Like, let's ask every community in the country for the worst data possible. We don't use it for anything. Point in time data doesn't tell you, is your homeless population getting older or younger? Are they local, or are they coming from elsewhere? What percentage are children? You know, none of those sorts of things could reliably pulled from point in time data. So quite frankly, we don't use it for anything. But data is the key in terms of being able to attack the issue of homelessness, because if you don't understand the problem, if you don't understand who is homeless in your community, you can't begin to identify the proper solutions.
Excellent.
I don't have much to add. These two are amazing in the knowledge that they have, and I think our providers here in Oregon have shared, you know, the detraction of the point in time count in terms of really being an undercount. And I know there are limitations in HMIS, but I think that overall it feels like a more holistic solution where we are accurately tracking more about each individual to really provide the level of support and services they need to resolve their housing insecurity.
Excellent. Thank you all. I got a bit overeager in asking all my questions and only had time for one audience one. So apologies to the other folks who submitted some questions. But that is all the time we have today. And I just wanted to thank our panelists, all three of you, Kevin, Nikisha, Megan. This has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Thank you as well to Dennis and Congressman Bonamici for their earlier conversation. And I just wanted to emphasize to our audience that here at the Terwilliger Center, we are engaged in this broader project of addressing the crisis of lack of affordable housing and the need for more housing supply, and finding the ways in which tackling that problem also gets us at tackling the problem of increasing homelessness across the country. So I hope you stay tuned in to our research, our many different written products that we put out on our website, as well as our future events. And with that, I'll let you all go. I hope you have an excellent rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.